talking to older people about loneliness. And and this is a female who was aged 67, talking about one of her friends, saying it's really difficult to quantify loneliness, really difficult, because, you know, at the bottom it's something within oneself. So this person has a kind of perhaps existentialist view of it. But she's talking about a friend of hers, saying it's sad for her because she does obviously feel very lonely. So this individual is saying, oh, I don't know what it means for me, but I can definitely spot it in somebody else, although she wouldn't admit it, which also raises another issue that that challenges us in gerontological work as in other work. Look how particular issues we may be interested in doing people find perhaps very stigmatising, stereotyping to accept. So I think this is an interesting quote about an older person saying, well, I don't know how you researchers are going to measure this, because we find it really difficult to find. I don't know how I would define it in me, but I can definitely spot it in somebody else. And I'm not lonely, but they are, which I think says a lot about representation of self, and I don't have time to go into much more of that. So as I say, there are a number of different ways that we can measure loneliness. There are lots of scales which I'm very happy to talk about at great length, some of which have been developed in Europe, some of which have been developed in the States, and some of which are a mishmash of all of them together. The work I'm going to present now, which is mostly my own, uses a self-rating question. So it's a simple question that says, how often do you feel lonely? All the time, some of the time, never, essentially. There are different categories one can do. So there's a lot of debate about whether that's a good question to use, because it requires somebody to admit that they're, inverted commas, that they're lonely. We can have that discussion. But certainly in empirical work in Britain, this question gets a good response. People answer it. You don't have the problems of missing data. It's also used quite widely across Europe and North America and Australasia, and I'll show some of that in a minute. So that's how it's measured here. So there are a number of different ways we can think about the prevalence of loneliness, and you'll be pleased to know I'm only going to give you 3 out of the 4, so be grateful for small mercies. This is about a very short summary of saying, okay, well, contemporary wisdom is that loneliness goes up with age and that older people are the loneliest group. How valid is that in Britain? And this, the red people are, the red line is men and the green line is females. Decided to confuse you by not using red and blue. So we can see, I certainly think we can see a number of things going on here, and I don't know if the mouse works. Okay, so if we look at young people, which is people under 25, we can see roughly 5% of men and just under 10% of women feel lonely. So then that you can, for men, you can argue there's more of a U-shaped distribution with it going up with age, and for women it sort of fluctuates a bit. But by the time we get to be 75, which is and over, which is when these data were concluded, we can see around about 12% of the population report themselves as being, this is always or often lonely. So the first thing to say, it's not universal, it's only it's a minority experience. The issues around peer-related loneliness, so which older people are most at risk, gender is unclear. And certainly we can see variations between different countries. And the empirical evidence across Europe is probably that there are 2 groups who are most at risk from loneliness. It's young adults, the 15 to 24 age group, and older people, but it's not exclusively older people. And I can come back to that in a moment. Of course, in Britain, we're always harking back to how much better everything was 50 years ago, or alternatively saying how dreadful it all is today, and we're all going, I'm not sure what the Russian phrase is for going to hell in a handcart, but it's all going to fall apart. And this slide is drawn from some work that I did for a Research Council grant in Britain, and resulted in me being effectively shown the door from a meeting by one of the major lobby groups for older people in Britain, who was convinced what I wanted to do was to compare the prevalence of loneliness in Britain in around about the year 2000 with what it had been in 1948 and 1954, with the assumption being from everybody that it would be much worse now. And as you can see from the slide, if we look at the top line, the percentage of people who say they were always and often lonely in 1948, 1954 and the year 2000 were more or less the same. And this did not please me to endear me to Age UK, and that was a research grant I never got. But there we go, such is life. So in terms, certainly in Britain, if you ask that question to older people, that's the answer you get. Around about 10% of people say, I'm often and always lonely, and it's remarkably stable. Where there has been variation is in the second and the bottom line. And so you can see there are fewer people who say, I'm never lonely, and more people saying, I'm sometimes lonely. Whether that's a real difference, whether that's a difference in how we use language over 60 years, one doesn't know. But if we're looking at the severe end, then there is remarkably little change. Another way of looking at loneliness is to ask older people how lonely they are now compared to how lonely they were 10 years ago, or how lonely they think they're going to be in 10 years' time. And again, if you look at this, the bottom line here, if we ask people that question, looking backward and looking forward, the majority of people don't expect it to change. Some people say, yes, I do expect to be more lonely. Perhaps they're anticipating widowhood or the onset of major illness. But also, interestingly, we see that some people as well, more or less the same number as those who think it will increase, are saying, well, I think it's going to get better. You know, I'm going to be less lonely, which is counterintuitive to the stereotypes that we have. And they would be a very interesting group to look at. What is it about them that makes them think in 10 years' time, I'm going to be much more socially engaged? Maybe they're just learning to Skype, or maybe they've just got their computer. But I think it's very important to get away from the idea that older people think everything is inevitably going to get worse. Most people think they'll carry on the same. Some people think it'll get better. Some people will think it'll get worse. If we're thinking about loneliness from a policy point of view, and developing interventions, we also need to know not simply how big is the problem, who it affects, which I'll come to in a moment, but also when it happens. And these are just some more data that highlight, if you're thinking about this from a service delivery point of view, the times that people are most likely to report that they feel lonely are either at night, which certainly in Britain the welfare state doesn't operate terribly well after 5 o'clock in the evening, and at weekends. And again, that's a problem for service provision, who just like to provide services between about 9 and 5 Monday to Friday. So you can see a couple of quotations here, and again about the issue of weekends, Saturdays and Sundays being particularly problematic. I've used both quantitative and qualitative work to try and start to unpick the experience of loneliness for older people, and some of the dimensions that we've also started to bring out are the kinds of the ones that we always think about, but issues of space and issues of the environment in which older people live. So you can see here a couple of quotations talking specifically about loneliness being the absence of a specific person, predominantly a spouse, and also their absence from a particular place in the local environment. So in this case, somebody saying, I've never sat on my own as my husband was always there. And they're very helpful to give us some insights into actually the profound feelings of loss that that explains some loneliness, but not all of it. And if we're thinking about that from a service delivery policy point of view, you know, how you can counteract that. I don't have time to go into everything about the risk factors for loneliness. This little table, I think, summarises where researchers from different paradigms have been operating and the kinds of variables and factors they've identified as being linked with loneliness. So issues around one's interpersonal environment, the quality of relationships, things about the intrapersonal nature of the individual, so issues of personality, issues of life stage, so retirement, widowhood, issues of the kind of environment that people live in. Does the environment promote social engagement? But also I think it's very important to remember the role of the wider socio-economic environment, and certainly poverty, material resources also affect the ability of people to maintain the quantity and the quality of the social relationships that they want. So we were just talking about computers and Skype, which is seen certainly in Britain as being the solution to engaging older people more with their families, but there's a cost involved, not only in the setup but also in your maintenance of your high-speed broadband line or whatever it is that makes these things work. And the other issue, I think, for Britain, and I apologise for the slightly ethnocentric focus of my talk, but it's very important as well when we're thinking about older people, thinking about the population that we put into that category. We talk about baby boomers, but there are also other groups that are coming into old age that are increasing the heterogeneous nature of ageing, certainly in Britain. And one of the major groups is the ageing of our ethnic minority populations. So the people who came to Britain in the post-war period from the old colonies, particularly the countries of the Caribbean, India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. These people are growing old, and what's the experience like for them as gerontologists, looking how people from different cultures experience ageing, can be very informative about what is unique and special and what is generic. And this is just some data looking at loneliness amongst minority communities. And the bars you need to look at are the red ones, which show you again, if we look at the white population, about 10% of older people report that they're lonely. If we look at the AC group, which is African Caribbean, we look at the Pakistani, Bangladesh and Chinese groups, the rates of reported loneliness are double the rates for the general population. And we can argue whether that's real or whether that's a linguistic effect, but if we take those temporarily at face value, that's a much bigger rate of loneliness. And the other interesting thing, so you might say, well, that's fine because all immigrant groups are going to experience, I don't know, social dislocation, disruption when they're growing old somewhere that they hadn't. But just look at the Indian group who are in the middle. So they too are migrants, they too are from South Asia, they report rates of loneliness that are very similar to the general population. So what's the explanation for that? And I don't have time, I'll tantalise you with that. I've got 3 slides to conclude. One of which is again for us to remember when we're looking at people in old age, they bring a life course perspective to that experience. And this is just some longitudinal data that I've conducted with my colleague Anne Bowling, where we looked at people and followed them up over 5 years. And over that time, basically we have 4 groups of people. People who are never lonely at either time point, people who are always lonely, people who became more lonely, and people who became less lonely. So if we're thinking about policy, then we need to understand that people who report loneliness in later life may be people who are lonely across their life course, may present very different kind of experience from people who become lonely in later life. And also the two interesting groups, because as gerontologists we spend loads of time in Britain studying people who have problems, because that's what people like us to study, that's what we get money to study the problem. Whereas actually the two most interesting groups in that graph, or in that table, are the almost half of people who were never lonely. So why are they not lonely? What is it about them that means that they don't experience this problem? And the people who got better. So there's some people who became less lonely. What is it about them? And if we can tease those out, could that help us to develop better policies? Okay, so I want to, for my last piece of empirical data, this is some data from the European Social Survey, which, if anybody hasn't used it, is a wonderful data set that you can just download online. And this is data about the prevalence of loneliness across a range of European countries. And I draw your attention to two things. Here we have at the top Denmark, Sweden, Norway, rates of loneliness that are very low. And at the bottom of the table, bottom right, I think that's that hand, here we can see the highest reported rates of loneliness are Slovakia, Poland, Hungary, Russia and the Ukraine. Whereas you can see the levels of loneliness reported by older people here are very much higher than other parts of Europe. Now, my question is, does that resonate with local, with national surveys? And why? Is that real? I don't know enough about the Russian scene to know whether that's is it a linguistic issue? Can you not translate loneliness into Russian or what? But I think it's some interesting data you might like to look at. Okay, so I'm going to leave the two best things to last. So that's the size of the problem. That's a quick summary of it. This is why you might think it matters. And clearly there is a reduced quality of life. There's evidence predominantly from America indicating that loneliness reduces quality of life. Well, British government's probably not that bothered too much about that. But what it does get bothered about are things that cost it money. And you can see here that there's a strong association, but what's the nature of the relationship between loneliness and negative health behaviours, use of health services, so hospital admissions, emergency room contacts, primary care contacts, and there's a very interesting review paper published, that if anybody wants the reference, suggesting that mortality is 50% higher for people who report that they're lonely. Now, I'm not entirely sure I believe it, but it's a very interesting paper. And so on the right-hand side, you have here another example of terminological inexactitude. This is from the head of the Public Health Service from England, which was in The Guardian, which is a British newspaper, last week, where he was saying being isolated, but actually what he meant was being lonely. But I've written to point out his mistake to him. He hasn't replied yet. So being lonely shortens life and increases disability. It's the equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So there's this big body of evidence that's certainly generating quite a lot of interest in Britain and North America, that actually that loneliness is worse for you than smoking. I leave it to you whether you feel you believe it. That's my substantive paper over, but I am just going to do a bit of shameless guerrilla marketing, I think this is called. As well as working at Brunel University, I'm the editor of a journal called Ageing and Society, which is a fabulous journal. If you don't all subscribe to it, you should. Get your libraries to subscribe to it. But yeah, we are an international journal. We've published very few papers from Russia. I'm very keen to get to encourage people to submit papers to us. I can't grant you any favours of saying that will be admitted, but we are an international journal, and I think certainly that Russia and Eastern European countries are extremely interesting countries, clearly with people interested in ageing, and it would be really great to receive contributions from you. And I thank you for your forbearance for my shameless advertising. Thank you.